hit the record button, that is. Okay, everyone. So we started recording. It's 7:02. If anyone else comes in, obviously I'll let them in and they can join. So thank you very much for logging on to our second webinar, which we've been really looking forward to. What's going to happen tonight is our colleague Adrian Cowin from Ronaldsway is going to give us a presentation. If you save your questions till after Adrian is done presenting, and if you use the little hand, if you put your hand up or use in the more actions button, the little hand gesture, and when your question's being asked, if you take your hand off, because just so we can keep track of everybody who's asking questions, and then after Adrian's presentation, we'll have questions, and then we will wrap up for the evening. Is there anybody that having issues? Anybody wants to raise anything before we start? Please let me know. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Adrian, who's going to present for us. Adrian, if you'd let me know when you want to go to the next slide, I shall do so. So I'm going to share your presentation now.
Thanks, Andrea. Hopefully I've unmuted myself, and good evening everyone, first am I. And thanks for inviting me to talk to this group this evening. It's from a perspective of myself as a physicist who happens to be an operational meteorologist who has worked for the Isle of Man Met Office at Ronaldsway Airport for 37 years. So I'm a meteorologist, a physicist, not a climatologist, but I've got a keen interest in climatology because the changing climate is having an impact on my day job and my colleagues with the increasing number of warnings we have to issue for severe weather.
Sorry to interrupt, Adrian. I'm just having problems uploading your, wouldn't you know, your presentation.
Are you? Okay.
If you just bear with me. Sorry, keep going, and I'll.
When I see the slides come up, I'll know you're ready for me to keep talking about those rather than talking about myself. But anyway, with that viewpoint, I suppose, of being an operational meteorologist, as I was saying, climate is a keen interest to ourselves. And it's strange enough that Isle of Man Government Department of Infrastructure and a joint working group has recognised this as an issue and set up the various forums and working groups, as well as the investigations and reports that we've all managed to enjoy reading over the last couple of years or so. But going back before that, there were already extensive reports being done for the Department of Infrastructure. JBA Consulting were looking at a range of infrastructure measures that may be needed to taken to improve our resilience against the impact of climate change in the next 20, 50, 100 years, even the next 200 years. And those reports pre-existed the more recent reports that are being worked on at the moment. So yeah, as I was saying, I'm interested in how can we compare what's being measured across the world with measuring the change from all the sources that we've got access to look at the trends, local evidence of these, as well as projections globally, but more importantly in the UK area, which are consistent with the IPCC report that underpin, of course, the Conference of Parties, United Nations seminars, the COP meetings that are going on, and the impact at a local level, because that's important to me as a person who has to deal with the day-to-day impacts of really severe weather, perhaps occurring more often, more frequent. So first caught my attention actually back in about 2002 when the Isle of Man suffered extreme coastal flooding event, which we knew was coming, but not the extent and depth that was coming. Surges in the Irish Sea were not very well modelled at the time, and I don't think climate change aspects have been modelled very well. As time goes on and you continue to live, but where increasing evidence came to light that caught my eye was via our friends in America, NASA, NOAA, and other organisations. Their monitoring networks of the oceans, the atmosphere from space, and the land observing network were able to come up with a visualisation of just how significantly severe the shifts in temperatures were across the planet, both on the land and oceans. And here's one that caught my eye back in 2018, which was looking at the time series from in the middle of the pre-industrial era, 1850 to 1900, all the way up to 2018, and dramatically highlighting how most of the planet's surface had seen during that period of the order of a few degrees, with only a few cold spots spotted in that period in some of the ocean areas. Also from that era, my colleagues in the UK Met Office gathered together data from various data sets globally, and they ended up with a chart like this, which showed variation in average temperature data sets, given a margin of uncertainty. But even with that margin of uncertainty, quite clearly you can see the rise from the pre-industrial times on the left, 1850 to 1900, where there's some variation due to weather events perhaps and other global climate drivers. But more recently, in the period from the right-hand side, 1975 onwards, perhaps a general trend that was heading upwards of the order of half a degree to a degree above the pre-industrial times. World Met Organization, as another group of scientists, got together and decided, let's have a look at the decadal chunking down of the data sets to see if there was a climate reality about things, because when we talk about climate change, we normally talk about a minimum chunk of 10 years. It's better to chunk it down traditionally across the world for comparison into 30-year chunks, and that's what's used the most. But even this one, a 10-year chunk, does show a trend, as you can see from the 1850s period, the small changes, decade on decade, all the way across to the 1980s onwards, where you end up with a rise, step rise every decade. So you end up by the end of 2018, the decade showing global average rise somewhere between 0.9 and 1 degree. I thought it useful to also make a comparison from that time with another indicator brought about by the measurement of sea ice, in particular the sea ice in the Northern Hemisphere. And this one was brought together by European and North American friends who measure sea ice and present it in colours since they started measuring sea ice, which was just before 1980 until current time. Showing it at the top end, the blues are the highest extent of the orange reds, extent of sea, and you can see, I think there quite clearly that since the period 2000, especially since 2010, most years have seen the lowest extent of sea ice in the Northern Hemisphere in comparison to that early period back in about 1980 to 1990. So definitely a change in sea ice being measured and observed by mainly satellite imagery and also aerial photography. To date, our friends from the European Environment Agency have brought a lot of this together, and have also found this as a published document very recently, the Arctic sea ice extent in comparison to the the 30-year chunk period, for reference 1981 to 2010, has shown quite a dramatic general trend downwards and some record extents in 2020, all an indicator of warming atmosphere as well as a warming ocean. We'll have a look at some ocean trends in a moment. Stepping back a little bit to another organisation who I'd like to bring all the data sets, my colleagues at the Royal Met Society, together their data sets independently from across the globe to look at the average global temperatures since 1850 on the left-hand side, all the way up, in this case, to about 2018. And we have the global average temperature, again showing that trend from the data sets, plotted a rate of rise, especially since the 1980s globally. It's interesting to pick out here, and we'll see this in other graphs, a small peak in about 1945 to 1950, and this was the industrial era after the Second World War. So a lot of countries had an industrial boom time in that period, and were building a lot of factories and power stations. Coal-fired power stations, of course, was the predominant thing there for that blip. The global average sea level, and we're looking at this a bit more closely in a moment, again showing a constant rise during the period, but perhaps increase in rate and rise of global average sea level. I'm aware that a lot of you have seen data like this before, but it helps set the bigger picture and maybe in a different way to the way some of us have seen it before. There's a different variation showing on the bottom chart the warming atmosphere. Instead of sea ice, they decided to look at the northern hemisphere snow cover, and the snow cover again reflecting that trend since about 1990, that all the observations showed less northern hemisphere snow cover than previously seen decades before. So I think you're getting the trend. Different scientific organisations, national and international, gathering data sets, making comparisons, and coming out pretty much the same indicator. So we end up in 2020, our colleagues, the World Met Organization, have come up with this update to the global picture, which is quite a stunning shot there of how much of the planet has ended up generally warmer in the last 2 years in comparison to the reference period. In this case, 1981 to 2010 was the 30-year reference period. As you can see there, it's indicating the global mean surface temperature, land and oceans, is of the order of 1.2 Celsius warmer than it was in the pre-industrial baseline. And this is despite the 2020 year being a period of cooling conditions across central and eastern parts of the Pacific because of the La Nina. And that can be seen on the Pacific Ocean chart there. That's one area that was below the normal reference period. But all the same, the decade 2011 to 2020 ended up being the warmest on record globally. There are also some other pools of cold water. For instance, there's a pool relatively steep. What we're looking at here is the World Met Organization have brought together all the latest data sets into one graph from the left-hand side to the 1850 industrial period to all the data sets up to date right up to 2020, showing the average rise, especially since the 1980s. Yet it's a rather jerky ride up and down. Climate change is not a smoothed out process. So when you do look at the overall trend, again, we're getting an order of rise of between 0.8 and 1 degree globally from those data sets combined from around the globe. Interestingly enough, I did mention the ocean heat content. Our oceans can absorb and contain 90% of the climate change heat that's held in the planetary system, and the ocean heat content at all depths has now been measured, and you can see there, especially in the last 30 years, with this rough ocean heat content at all depths. This is mainly due to the sharing of the energy down through the ocean currents. And of course, it's the ocean heat content which is the driver behind thermal expansion, and thermal expansion is one of the big aspects of global sea level rise. That's picked out by the sea level rise charts, again from the World Met Organization's bulletin for rounding things up for 2020, even allowing for the Pacific cooling of La Nina, which has caused a perhaps temporary slight pause in sea level rise, but altogether, since the 1990s, globally, there has been a global sea level rise of the order of 80 to 90 millimetres. This is brought together mainly, by the way, from fixed sea level tide gauges around the planet, as well as the input of satellite measurements. And there's an estimate averaging of the order of a few millimetres per year. There's some regional variation, but most parts of the planet's oceans are lifting by a few millimetres per year. The European Environment Agency have kindly done a project that feeds into the IPCC reports, and I found this graphic of particular interest for the European region. The trend since 1970. It's picked up mostly rising sea levels, except for a few exceptions around some of the coastal areas of Scandinavia. Around the British Isles, there has been a rising trend confirmed of the order of 2 to 3 millimetres in our neck of the woods in that period since 1970. That's a few millimetres per year confirmed. And the indicated on the same graphic trend for the century, to focus perhaps for the outcome of 2070 to 2100. Plus, in this year of about, according to their estimates, 50 to 60 centimetres of sea level rise by the end of this century. This is assuming a pathway, an RCP pathway 8.5, which is the higher end scenario, projects roughly a temperature rise of towards 4 degrees by the end of the century in comparison to the industrial times. The final component of this that most of you will be aware of, what is causing it, the main cause is anthropogenic input in the form of global greenhouse gases. And one of particular measurements of geological history is carbon dioxide. We can sample that in deep ice cores from the Antarctic and the Arctic. As many of you may have heard, the interest is to look at any period above 400 parts per million, which has never been seen before in geologic terms until recent years, when the CO2 levels and the concentrations that are measured continue to rise sharply, very sharply in geologic terms, in the history of the Earth's atmosphere as well. So interestingly enough, the latest figures for all the greenhouse gases confirm continuation of that since 1985 to the current time. On the left-hand side, the carbon dioxide trend has exceeded this 400 parts per million. and is currently sat in excess of 410 parts per million as it continues to rise globally. The other big greenhouse gases don't get mentioned as much, but occasionally do. Nitrous oxide rising, and another strong greenhouse gas. So this was the geological trend of carbon dioxide as seen in the global atmosphere measured from ice core samples. Lots of variation historically, especially during volcanic periods of CO2 parts per million indicated there, but it had never been above 300 parts per million until we got to industrial times in the modern world, and that period after the Second World War, the CO2 emissions measured in the atmosphere exceeded 300 parts per million and continued to rise. And the next threshold was breached in recent times, greater than 400 parts per million. And if we look at the next slide, please, we can end up seeing that it continues to rise since that period and stayed above the 400 parts per million, which was a concerning level that all scientists were worried about. And it is in excess of 410 parts per million CO2, and that's all mainly driven by anthropogenic input by man himself, being very industrial across the planet, as is the middle graph of nitrous oxide, another indicator of global atmosphere pollution, with a strong greenhouse gas. And the other strong greenhouse gas that is on the rise and of great concern is the right-hand indication there, the rise of methane. And some of that concern is a lot of that is natural rise, and some of the methane is being released by the Earth's lakes, pockets of gas that are stored under the lakes and also stored in Arctic tundra and such likes. As the ground defrosts, thaws out, some of the methane is being released into the atmosphere, and there's concerns that that could become a runaway process as the frozen tundras of the planet continue to thaw out. And that's one aspect of climate change modelling where there's the biggest rate of uncertainty. There could be a massive increase of the strong greenhouse gas that is methane. Let's, instead of worrying about the global picture that many of you have read about, let's look at this little lump of rock in this part of the planet and measurements that were taken locally, as we'll see on the next slide, at Ronaldsway Airport. This is looking at the mean maximum temperatures that we have had since one of those reference periods that I talk about, lots of people talk about, and that's from about 1961 to 1990. So we thought we'd start there and do a 15-year running mean maximum temperature. So it's a 15-year running maximum up until the current time. And I think although the scale's exaggerated, you can see the trend there is very clear to see, and the mean maximum temperatures generally showing an upward trend at a rising rate since about 1990 to where we are today. Over that whole period, that's a rise of about 0.8 Celsius during that 30-year period. If we look at the next slide of the similar thing for the minimum temperatures, a little bit more shocking in that the total rise over the same period very clearly indicated yet again, but it's a greater rise than the mean maximum. The mean minimum rise is a total on the Isle of Man of 1.2 Celsius in the 30-year period, 1990 to 2020. You can see that there's been some rate changes in the last 10 years or so. You could say it's slowed down or declined, but we're only talking about small amounts there. But all the same, that's considered to perhaps maybe be just a temporary climate change blip. It's a pause, it's plateaued. The reasons for that, not quite certain, but it's maybe driven by global drivers rather than anything local. But I'd say it's bigger than the Isle of Man. But it's interesting, the Isle of Man temperature profiles do confirm that global picture, on average, a rise of 0.8 to 1.2 Celsius in the last 30 years. So it just pulls together those temperature trends from Ronald's Way's figures, mean maximum temperatures and mean minimum temperatures since our records started in 1947. Yes, plenty of annual variations, but you can see in the last 30 years that confirmed upward trend to both those aspects. We can go a bit further back on the Isle of Man, and as the next slide will show, which is the Douglas statistics, and the Douglas statistics are from 1878 until the early 2000s. So a bit more compressed, but you can still see that tendency to rise in the last period. If we look at a heat map here, sort of a heat map was the next slide that was coming up. And we're looking at the long-term means highlighted either per month and per year when it deviates by more than half a degree beyond the mean since 1947. So at the top of the graph, you've got beginning of the Ronald's Way statistics, 1947. At the bottom of the graph, the current year. I think you can see across the minimum temperatures there that in the last 20 to 30 years, more months have been showing half a degree or more above, confirming the warming trend. And the keen-eyed amongst you will see on the right-hand side, about 10 years back, there's 1 year that was slightly bucking that trend and turned out to be colder than average. And that year was 2010. You might remember that was a year that was a bit of a blip locally. We had snow and ice to begin the year and to end the year in 2010. But apart from that year, every other year has been average, and many of the years above average temperatures annually when you look at the mean minimums. And if we look at the next slide, please, which is the mean maximums, you end up with a similar trend of warming, but strangely indicated by the minimums in comparison to the maximums. So an indicator there that our nights are generally warmer than they used to be, and we have less frost in the winter than we used to have in the previous period in our records. So moving on to the next slide, please, so we don't run out of time for you to ask questions. Quite simply, to put it in place, the UK, like the rest of the planet, got to take climate seriously. We're looking at how we're going to do that, because it's going to affect everybody. We're monitoring the here and now with climate projections as to what is happening, and start to figure out what we may do to become more resilient going forward. And the next slide, please. Just confirming what yourselves have done recently, and that proves that everybody needs to know about future climate, because it affects everything that we do at a local level and beyond, and all sorts of industries, infrastructure, planning, and the ecosystems that we live in, the sensitive ecosystems for farmers, fisheries, etc. So the latest version of the climate change predictions that have any relevance to ourselves locally with the UK CP 18 predictions, which is on the next slide. And that picked out UK CP 18, the climate change changes we can expect over the land and over the sea in the foreseeable future for the rest of this century. So the UK CP 18, the climate prediction panel brought together by the Environment Agency and the Met Office, DEFRA and the Department of Business and Industry, have all given up their time and efforts and computing power to come up with the prospect. It looks like very likely that we'll have a greater chance of hotter, drier summer, perhaps, but more importantly, wetter winters. The different climate paths, the different scenarios are on the next slide for the UK temperatures. So on the left is the lowest scenario outcomes, which does show a rise, a slow rise. If we were lucky enough to be at the lower end scenario predictions of between 1.5 to 2 degrees, which would marry up with the IPCC reports recommendations that were fed into the COP conferences, that we need to be aiming for this as well. Unfortunately, the reality is somewhere likely to be in excess of that, and we're more likely to be on the 8.5 pathway to something more than that. And all the falling temperatures are over rise, and we're just hoping that we don't reach the higher pathway. If we look at the next impact of the higher pathway, I'm afraid for us as an island nation, we should be concerned because it's sea level rise, which is indicated on the next slide. It's just that the UK CP18 is important to us as an island nation. Little lump of rock in the Irish Sea, we're at risk of problems with sea level rise. And, you know, it's confirmed really under all scenarios that there'll be an impact that we need to consider when we're coming to planning for resilience and mitigation. So the next slide shows the variation scenarios around the British Isles, and every scenario, whether it's low emission ranges showing in the blue or the orange shades, the high level emissions range, that all a lot more sea level rise than what we'd be comfortable with during this century. We can have a little bit more detail on that by looking at the next slide, and which lets us have a look on the sort of top left-hand side there, the Belfast predictions, ranging from perhaps as little as 11 centimetres to 52 centimetres in a low emission scenario, but a lot more than that, up to perhaps 94 centimetres of sea level rise in a high scenario situation by 2100. And that's without the unknowns of the possible additional sea level rise caused by melting sea ice and glacier melt globally. And the sea level rises beyond 2100, all the emission scenarios continue to show sea level rise being significant for the following 2 centuries as well. So this is the one of the biggest concern, that perhaps we have to think about doing something on the Isle of Man in the shorter term and medium term, never mind the longer term. So the next slide just sums that up really, that we have the impacts of climate change. All climate model scenario are going to give us a warmer atmosphere with more energy, more moisture, driving powerful weather systems. Areas of deep low pressure could drive stormier weather, including storm surges in our oceans, and the oceans themselves are going to rise due to thermal expansion and further melt of ice and snow, especially in the northern hemisphere. And as meteorologists, the headline for me of concern there is the higher risk of all this extra energy driving more severe weather events, more extreme, more often, is the sort of strap line that we're working to. And what does that look on that indicate? It's the best guidance that we've got. That the impact of the Isle of Man would be most likely more occurrence of significant winter flooding, the possibility of seeing summer heat waves and droughts more frequently than what we have done before, the coastal threat that we've covered quite nicely already as being a big impact one for the Isle of Man. It's an economic and social thing as well as the ecosystem. the infrastructure and wildlife on the Isle of Man. Very briefly, the next slide is my way of summing up the options very starkly. The options are: you let it happen, natural change, albeit driven at a higher rate because of the input of man-made activities. Or do you go for hard defences, which can be costly and perhaps limited in scope of protection and for how long those hard defences work? Having said that, some hard defences have proved very cost effective already. An example there of the flooding in Castletown in early 2014, the extent of the flooding. Measures have been put in place now. A scheme that was being put in place to defend that part of Castletown will prevent that from happening again, and it's done on a very cost-effective way. That although it was a fairly expensive project, the amount of protection you'll get from that for the next 20 to 50 years far outweighs the cost of the project. So a success story in Castletown, which may perhaps be replicated in the coming years if decisions are made as to where to protect next, which might, for instance, include Laxey, it might, for instance, include Ramsey, and it might include Douglas as an example of priorities that have to be considered by the DOI and the Isle of Man government, multi-agencies and politicians over the next few years. So the final slide there was the mitigation prospects, and that is driven not only really by local strategies, but the big strategies in the global picture that have come together by United Nations climate change conferences. And the next one, of course, most of you will know, is COP26 in Glasgow, and many countries will be represented there. And I even heard rumours that there's been a call for a suggestion that perhaps the Isle of Man could have some representation, perhaps at COP26, which would be rather interesting to say the least. And I've taken up most of your time this evening. Sorry about the technical glitches, but that's where I've ended up with. And so any questions, please?
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you so much, Adrian. I know we had some technical issues, but unfortunately, it's the nature of webinars. I think we always tend to have technical glitches. Guys, if you want to ask Adrian a question, if you in the more actions in the little, if you put your hand up in your little yellow raised hand, I'll get them to you. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Adrian.
Hi.
Very interesting slides there, and I think you concisely put it all together. But a lot of us would probably have seen bits of that in other places as well. So it's not come as a great shock to us, but it's still, nevertheless, it still is shocking to see. Now, when we're looking at flooding, we can anticipate that because we know most of the flooding is going to come at high tide, and we can predict high tides because that's fairly, with having tide tables and what have you, that's fairly predictable. So we know if there's going to be a flood, we can have the flood defences out, and you can work on those situations. So for a foreseeable event, you can plan for them and you can work on them. What I want to get a gist of is in the winter storms that we're talking about, if we're going to be getting greater winds, is there going to be, are we looking at there's going to be more damage to our infrastructure in winters? And when I say infrastructure, I mean, we keep hearing about trees blowing down, and they're probably elderly trees or something like that. But are we looking at buildings that could be damaged? And if so, are we looking at, are an architect going to have to start building to a higher standard to protect buildings? And does that mean some of our older buildings might not be lasting as long as they should?
Well, essentially, yeah, that is a very good point, that design structures and strengthening of existing structures will have to be considered by a lot of people, because a warmer atmosphere has more energy. More energy will manifest itself in more winter gales, so tending to be more frequent. but also possibly the more extreme storm events will also happen more often. That'll tend to be driven by the powerful jet streams becoming stronger, and therefore the Atlantic depressions will tend to be deeper, more stormy. So there is a higher risk of storm damage caused by the severe gales. The other aspect of deeper areas of low pressure is they are the bigger driver of storm surges. So it's one thing to get a gale and a high tide, which, as you say, is predictable. What we don't want is the storm surge values to be even higher than what they are at the moment. Most storm surges in our neck of the woods are 0.5 metre to 1 metre. But if you were to end up with deeper low pressure systems than you've seen historically, you could be talking about storm surges in the Irish Sea in excess of 1.5 metres. And you don't want that extra 0.5 metre of storm surge adding onto a spring high tide driven by a gale, because most of our harbour defences at the moment can cope with a storm surge of up to typically 0.5 metre. So there's an aspect about defending your harbour areas with more a height in your defences, and those defences also having to be stronger to take the impact of the kinetic energy of the impact of the weight of water, especially on the promenades, for instance. Don't forget that a cubic metre of water weighs 1 tonne, and if you move many tonnes of water along at 20 miles an hour, hitting your coastal defences, that's a lot of kinetic energy, very damaging. So yeah, a stormy atmosphere overall, our design of all our infrastructures should be considered being beefed up to be more resilient, to take that punishment.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Adrian. Is that answer your question, Peter? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very concise. Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. Richard, you had your hand up next. Oh, do we have you on, Richard? Okay, we might have had some audio issues there, so I will move on to Ada. Would you like to ask Adrian a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Adrian. Very insightful. And if I look at your slide 11, it shows a path of sea levels that continues to be quite worrying. And the big culprit in terms of carbon emissions and greenhouse emissions is China. And they have committed to greenhouses, to carbon neutrality only in 2060. So the path will continue to grow, accelerate until countries that are big emitters will do something more meaningful. So my question to you, that in the meantime, places like the Isle of Man or other coastal areas will be subject to this type of damage caused by high sea levels. And do you know what other regions that have the same issues are doing in order to prepare before carbon neutrality becomes a reality?
Yeah, I think there are lots of countries globally and more concerned than the European countries, the British Isles included, because there are many countries who are already near the threshold of having large areas of their land often submerged, if not permanently submerged. So, of course, on the other side of the planet from us, the area of concern would be a lot of the low-lying islands, perhaps in the Indian Ocean and the coastal areas that are surrounding the Indian Ocean, such as Bangladesh, where an extra 20 centimetres of sea level rise would cause permanent significant problems, probably causing the mass migration of many, many millions of people who could never return to the area of land that becomes submerged. And the other example of even just 10 to 20 centimetres of global sea rise that is essentially unstoppable, unfortunately, would be parts of the Pacific, where there are already low-lying islands seeing a reduction of the available land that they have become permanently submerged already. So there's an early indicator for the rest of the planet that it is happening, and if 10 or 20 centimeters of sea level rise has caused those problems, permanent problems in some parts of the planet, watch out where you're living. If global predictions of sea level rise of between 40 centimeters and 1 meter by the end of the century, you're going to have to think what you're going to do to protect your coastlines, your harbours, what you're going to do to protect your infrastructure, what you're going to do with your populations, how you're going to protect those populations, or are you going to look at moving populations? And moving populations on any continent would be a nightmare, to say the least.
Thank you for that, Adrian. Adrian, does that answer your question?
Just wonder, so what people need to do to plan in advance, because you take a long time before you revert the trend.
It will, and the pace of change is the problem. The rate of change makes it very difficult to plan. Can you do something quick enough that will make a real difference? Because the problem's already been set in motion because of those industrial times when parts of the planet became very industrial, such as China, as you've mentioned, and India is another example. In the 1980s, with the massive rise of industry and coal-fired power stations, that set the rise into the global climate change effect. So you can slow that, and you need to slow that, in my opinion, if you're going to have a chance for any government, any country or collection of countries to build their resilience and adapt to the change that is coming.
Thanks very much, Adrian. John, I know you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask Adrian a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adrian. That was really insightful, and I appreciate that. My question's a bit on the side. So we understand the threats, we understand the impacts and the consequences of either taking no action or taking action. The consequences of climate change are evident, and you know, the knowledge about that, the information around that is more widespread, which is great. As an island, how do you think, or how can you work with government to take advantage and turn some of these threats that are a consequence that we, other than planning to build walls of sea, how do we turn some of this into opportunities for us on an island? So there's a natural consequence of our footprint on the planet, which is going to result in higher sea levels, greater storms, more wind, tidal surges. So how can we benefit from that? How can we turn these threats into opportunities as well? These are things we've got to live with, remember, aren't they?
They are indeed. So yeah, mankind as well as nature have got to adapt, and perhaps the changing climate will give new opportunities in agriculture. By that I mean our farmers in the British Isles and on the Isle of Man may have new opportunities to grow species, crops that they've never had an opportunity to consider before. And that's not a bad thing, that's diversification. There may be opportunities in other industries. For instance, you mentioned how do we live in a climate that is warmer with maybe a higher tidal range, more wind. Well, the clue there is that might help us mitigate some of the changes that have been happening by making use of those natural forces. Why not buy into the technology that is capturing wind power or wave power or tidal power and reduce our dependence on carbon-based fuels for energy? Because the atmosphere is now containing a lot of natural energy that we have the technology to capture. If we've, as a nation, got the foresight to take the opportunity to jump into that and grab some of that wind power or thermal or tidal, all those opportunities exist. Whether you grab them or not And even industry could buy into some of that. You know, the Isle of Man has got some areas of high-tech industry, and you know, an example of engineering, where we could use some of those engineering skills towards some of these new technologies as an opportunity. There's a whole range of things, I suppose, and as a forum, I'm sure many of you have got better ideas than me.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I suppose my reason for posing the question with the group here is for us to also understand that, you know, as a responsibility to try and limit the impacts of climate change. Climate change is an action that's going to occur. To what level or degree that is, we've got a lower scenario, a higher scenario, and that's horrible to think in some parts of the world the damage it'll do. But at the same time, I think, as you mentioned, we need to understand how we can live with climate change, adapt, and seek the opportunities from it, because we can't do anything to stop it, for want of a better phrase. So it's just interesting to think about the way we talk about these. Sometimes is all about the threats and the impacts. I think we need to start considering a change of language or mindset about how do we, as well as changing, do we start learning to live with this? And how do we start thinking about pressing government to take early decisions? You know, I think there's a lot of decisions that we see around the world where governments kick it down the, you know, we say kick the can down the road, thinking that future governments can take the rap for it. But I think that's where I was coming from. But thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Adrian. Chris, you've got your hand up for a question.
Yeah, just a quick one for Adrian. Apart from the fact that I quite agree with what John was saying just now about the need to consider opportunities as well as threats, and the opportunities aren't, even though we're a small island, we can still adapt our economy to benefit from the things that everyone's going to need to do and so obviously that's a very important factor. But the primary question I wanted to ask was actually just a bit more technical. I know there's a very long-term sea level temperature data set, sea temperature data set that comes from the Port Erin Marine Lab, which I believe was being, even post closing of the Marine Lab, was being maintained by government. I kind of just wondered if Adrian was aware of that, and if we still maintain it, because it is one of the longest term reference data sets in the world, I believe.
Yeah, well, it's a great thing having these long-term data sets, and that's part of the network that was also originally part of the global tidal gauge network. You know, and organisations such as Proudman's Oceanographic Lab, who are now calling themselves part of NOC, the National Oceanographic Centre, based in Southampton and Liverpool. They're part of an international collection of data sets of tidal heights, the biggest data sets of tide gauges around the planet, but also global sea temperatures. Now, the Port Erin sea temperatures were maintained by the University of Liverpool, the Port Erin Marine Lab, and we used to obtain those from them as part of scientific collaboration, which is great. But of course, University of Liverpool pulled out from there some years ago now, to say the least. But we have got there still access, and we do still maintain the tidal gauge. In fact, it's been renewed by the DOI. The sea temperature, there was a gap, but we have installed a probe with the new gauge. It's right alongside the Port Erin lifeboat station, so you can picture where it is. And so we're trying to replicate its depth and position as close as we can to what the University of Liverpool were measuring. It's not quite an exact match, because quite often that they were, I think their readings were taken further out, but at the same depth. So it's the best that we can do to replicate that set and build on the long data set. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because there is ocean heat buildup, even in the Irish Sea. And in my period of time, 37 years, I've noticed that the winter time temperatures in the Irish Sea are now warmer than they used to be. We used to quite regularly tide in recent decades. We've quite often stayed at 7 Celsius or more, even in the winter. So even in the Irish Sea, there's been a measurable rise in sea level temperature.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Adrian. I think the daily ones were actually taken off the breakwater, so I think what you're doing now is probably a pretty good replica of it.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I think we're trying to replicate it by at least measuring it at the same depth, and it's not far away from the breakwater. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Carol. Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, I'm
You've
done.
got a
Thank you.
Adrian? Carol, do you have a question for Adrian?
Hi, yes, please. Hi, Adi.
Hi.
Mine was more about the seasonals and the way it works. To me, the season seems to be changing, and they have done for a few years, and quite a few years. You know, what used to be a winter seems to be milder, and our spring seems to be very little, and the summer seems to be starting earlier. And we get to the stage now where it seems every year we get to about May time when we end up having a water shortage and things like that. And obviously, this is only going to increase as we can see by your graphs and what you think the temperature is going to go to and what it can go to and everything else. So is there, I don't know what we can do about it. I mean, for us as a climate change group, should we be looking at some way to, because if we're going to get a larger and heavier and more often heavier rain during the short period of winter that we're getting, we should be looking really to conserve this rain in a better way. So is there any way that you can think that this could be done so that we can extend extend it somehow, or in a way to create it? I mean, the only way I can think of is another reservoir on the island or something like that, or maybe 2 reservoirs, but that would be a cost to government. I'm just wondering if there's any other way of doing it, just to help with the winter, because as it is now, our summers, we spend most of it having to save water.
Well, yeah, recent experiences would indicate that, but I would say we should never take just recent experiences as proof of a growing trend. The only thing it does perhaps confirm is that we have to be aware that as climate change predictors show, we lurch from one extreme to the other. And last year happened to be maybe a fairly good example of lurching from one of the wettest winter periods with some flooding events straight into a record-breaking warm, sunny, dry spring, which immediately put stress on our water reserves. You went from having virtually just under 100% capacity in the reservoirs down to 60% in 3 months. Hence the hosepipe ban, especially with the prospect.
But that happens every year now. We have a hosepipe ban every single summer, and it's if the climate carries on like it is assumed it's going to, the way it is now, then that will carry on indefinitely. There must be some way in which we can change that.
Well, this is, I'm aware that this is being looked at as a multi-agency task, but led by Manx Utilities. This has to be taken seriously, because we are looking at having more often warmer drought summers. Yep. So you do have to plan for that.
It's not just for residents. I'm thinking of the farmers and industry and things like that on the island. I mean, if we run out of water every summer, you know, the farmers need it for their land, you know, to grow the crops, the vegetables to feed, you know, for their cattle. Correct. Wherever it is. So we need to be thinking about it seriously, you know, as well as the high tides and destruction that can bring. We need to also think about the dry periods, and if they extend, a great deal, and that's an issue as well.
So the water conservation issues are real, and those are going to have to be tackled by all sorts of people. But never mind water conservation, there's a real need perhaps to look at the overall storage capacity of fresh water and treating that fresh water on the Isle of Man so that we have got enough capacity to get through drought periods.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian and Carol. So,
Thanks,
Adrian, I've got a question from Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah, just following on from that last conversation, we're looking at a lot of rain in winter, possibly flooding, and flooding not just coming in from the sea, but coming down the rivers and coming down off the mountains, and the rainfall causing flooding. And then we're talking about droughts in summer. Are these not the same problem? And what I mean is, if we're going to slow the water coming down in rainfall causing damage, shouldn't we be trying to slow it down enough that we could then use it in summer if we've got droughts? And that's not necessarily about building more excuse me, reservoirs. Is that not something that could be done with planting more trees in certain areas and the use of plants and that kind of thing?
There would be an element of sense of that, especially to reduce the impact of severe rainfall events. If you could slow down the rate of runoff from the uplands into the streams and rivers, that'd be a welcome approach, and that approach is being looked at. There is some mitigation work done on that already in the uplands by partners in the DOI and DEFA, and I know they're going to do more work like that in terms of slowing down the rainfall runoff rate and retaining some of that water in holding areas in the uplands. Whether you retain that naturally or by man-made or a mixture of the two is something that will have to be decided. How you utilise that in terms of mitigating the effect of drought is something that I'm not an expert in, but I would certainly welcome slowing down the rainfall runoff from severe events. I'm sure many low-lying parts of the island who suffer such events would also welcome that approach, so we could reduce the risk of flash flooding in places like Laxey or Solby, for an example. And I mean, the flash flooding events could happen anywhere on the island, and we shouldn't forget that we've had similar flash flooding events in the south of the island in Ballasalla. So although Laxey has highlighted at least two relatively recent flooding events that need to be mitigated against, controlling that in the uplands would seem a sensible way forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Right, we've got time for one more question. Carol, you've got your hand up.
I have, if it's okay to just mention this. There's the water treatment plant, Miriveg, and that actually treats, obviously, the sewage that goes around. That water, I don't know if it is now or not, something I'd be interested to find out, somebody from the MUA. That water is being pumped directly into the sea, but it's actually almost 100% pure when it goes through its final treatment. It goes through multiple treatment baths, and when it comes out the other side, it's more or less pure water. And I think they just pump it into the sea, which is a waste if that's true. Surely that could be put into a reservoir of some kind to be reused, even if it only goes onto farmland or something.
Yeah, it's not an area that I know the details on, so I can't really. I'm sure some colleagues within government departments will know the answer to how that water quality is monitored and treated, and never mind where does it go after it is treated.
I'm only going back because I paid a visit there at one time, and I remember seeing the tanks and being told that the water is purified to an extent, but it just goes straight into the sea. And I remember thinking at the time, what a waste. and especially if we're going to need it, you know, when it can be used for good use. And maybe something that this is something that the team could think about asking the MUA for information on.
Yeah, I like your thinking, but whether or not we're talking about usable volumes there or not is another question. You know, is it suitable, and what sort of volumes are, could be obtained anyway? And then how do you distribute that?
I'm sure the processing of it is it produces pellets from one stage of it and water from the other stage of it, and I think the pellets are reused again for other things. So I'm sure the water could be reused, but we need, I suppose, that needs to be clarified by the MUA.
But it's Johnny. That's a very good way of looking at it. You know, that's turning a byproduct into an opportunity. I think it's a great idea, and it's certainly got merit. Anything's got merit, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys, for all your brilliant questions. And I want to extend a special thanks to Adrian. Thank you so much for your presentation and for bearing with us with the audio problems. And thank you for taking questions as well. We do really appreciate it. So we will let you go now, Adrian, and enjoy your evening. So thank you very much.